A 17-year-old boy sits alone in the cockpit of a commercial jet, 35,000 feet above the ocean, with both pilots unconscious behind him and 143 passengers depending on his next move. This is the story of how a lightning strike turned a routine flight into a desperate fight for survival, and how an ordinary teenager became the only person standing between everyone on board and disaster. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. And please like and subscribe for more videos like this. Henry Mitchell was not supposed to be in the cockpit that day. He was supposed to be in seat 20B, listening to music and trying not to think about the calculus exam waiting for him back home. The flight from Seattle to Miami was meant to be boring, just another 5 hours of cramped legs and stale air. His parents had sent him to visit his grandmother for spring break, and now he was heading back, alone, just another face in a plane full of strangers. Henry was a quiet kid, the type who kept his head down and his earbuds in. He was not popular at school. He was not athletic. He was not the kind of person people noticed. But Henry had one unusual hobby that most of his classmates knew nothing about. For the past 3 years, he had been obsessed with flight simulators. Not the simple games that kids play on their phones, but the serious, complex programs that actual pilots use for training. He had spent thousands of hours in his bedroom, learning every switch, every gauge, every procedure. His parents thought it was just a phase, something he would grow out of. They did not understand why he spent his allowance on a yoke and pedal set, or why he watched cockpit videos until 2 in the morning. Henry did not talk about it much. It was just something he did, something that made sense to him in a way that school and friends never quite did. The flight took off on time. The weather forecast showed clear skies for most of the route, with just a small band of storms near the Georgia coast. Nothing unusual. Nothing the pilots had not handled 1,000 times before. Captain David Ross had been flying for 26 years. First Officer Jennifer Huang had logged over 8,000 hours. They were professionals, calm and experienced, the kind of crew that made flying look easy. Henry settled into his seat, pulled out his phone, and opened a flight tracking app. He watched the little plane icon crawl across the map, checking the altitude, the speed, the heading. Old habits. 3 hours into the flight, somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, the sky began to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, thick and bruised and angry. The seatbelt sign came on. The flight attendants moved quickly through the cabin, checking trays and seats. Henry looked out the window and felt his stomach tighten. He had seen storms in his simulator, had practiced flying through turbulence and wind shear, but he had never seen clouds that looked like this. They were not just dark. They were alive, roiling and twisting, lit from within by flashes of lightning. The plane began to shake, gentle at first, then harder. Bags rattled in the overhead bins. A woman across the aisle gripped her armrest. The turbulence grew worse. The plane pitched and rolled, caught in invisible hands that shook it like a toy. Henry closed his eyes and tried to breathe slowly. He told himself that planes were built for this, that turbulence could not bring down a modern jet, that everything would be fine. Then the lightning hit. The flash was so bright that Henry saw it through his closed eyelids. The sound was not a crack or a boom. It was a physical thing, a pressure that slammed into his chest and left his ears ringing. The cabin lights flickered and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in a dim, greenish glow. People screamed. Somewhere, a child was crying. Henry opened his eyes and saw smoke drifting from the ceiling panels. The plane was still flying, still stable, but something was wrong. He could feel it. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The cockpit door opened and a flight attendant stumbled out, her face pale and tight with fear. She looked around the cabin, her eyes wild, searching for something or someone. Henry watched her grab another flight attendant and whisper urgently. Both women disappeared back toward the cockpit. 2 minutes later, the first flight attendant returned to the cabin. Her hands were shaking. She moved to the intercom, pressed the button, and her voice came over the speakers, thin and strained. She said that there had been an incident. She said that the pilots were receiving medical attention. She asked if there was anyone on board with flight experience. The cabin erupted in confused murmurs. Henry felt his heart hammering. He knew what those words meant. The pilots were not receiving medical attention. They were unconscious, or worse. He sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing. Flight experience. He had flight experience, but not real experience. Not in an actual plane. Just a simulator. Just a game. What could he possibly do? But no one else was standing up. No one else was moving. The flight attendant repeated the question, her voice rising, desperate now. Henry looked around the cabin. He saw fear on every face. He thought about his mother, about how she would want him to stay quiet and safe. He thought about all the times he had been told to let adults handle things, to not make waves, to stay in his lane. Then he thought about the 143 people on this plane. All of them trapped in a metal tube 6 miles above the ocean. All of them depending on someone, anyone, to do something. Henry unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. His legs felt weak. He raised his hand. The flight attendant saw him and rushed over. She asked if he was a pilot. Henry said no, but he had simulator experience, thousands of hours, and he knew the systems. She stared at him. He was just a kid, tall and gangly, with messy hair and a backpack covered in patches. But she had no other options. No one else had stood up. No one else had raised their hand. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the cockpit. The scene inside was worse than Henry had imagined. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, unconscious, their heads lolled forward. The lightning had caused an electrical surge that triggered some kind of explosion in the cockpit ventilation system, releasing a burst of toxic fumes. Captain Ross and First Officer Huang had breathed it in before they could react. Now they were out, unresponsive, and the plane was flying on autopilot through the worst storm Henry had ever seen. The cockpit was a chaos of flashing warnings and alarm sounds. Red lights blinked across the panel. The artificial horizon showed the plane tilting at a dangerous angle. The autopilot was struggling to maintain control, fighting against wind shear and turbulence that it was not designed to handle. Henry stood in the doorway, his mouth dry, his hands shaking. He had dreamed about sitting in a real cockpit. He had imagined it 1,000 times. But not like this. Never like this. The flight attendant was talking to him, asking him what to do, but her words were just noise. Henry forced himself to breathe. He made himself think. He stepped forward, climbed into the captain's seat, and gripped the yoke. It felt different from his simulator, heavier, more real. He scanned the instruments, forcing his training to take over. Airspeed, altitude, heading, vertical speed. The plane was at 33,000 feet, descending slowly, pushed down by the storm. The autopilot was on. But it was not coping. Henry needed to take control. He needed to fly this plane. But first, he needed help. He reached for the radio, his hand hovering over the switch. He had listened to hundreds of hours of air traffic control recordings. He knew the phrases, the protocols. But knowing and doing were different things. He pressed the button. His voice came out thin and cracked. He said that this was Flight 227, that they had an emergency, that both pilots were incapacitated. There was a pause. Then a voice came back, calm and professional. The controller asked for his position and the nature of the emergency. Henry gave the details as best he could. He said that he was not a pilot, but that he had simulator experience. He said that he needed help. The controller did not hesitate. He said that his name was Marcus, that he was going to stay with Henry the whole way, that they were going to get through this together. Marcus asked Henry to check the autopilot settings. Henry scanned the panel and read them off. Marcus said that the autopilot was not going to handle this storm. Henry was going to have to disconnect it and fly manually. Henry felt his stomach drop. Flying manually meant taking full control of the plane, becoming responsible for every movement, every adjustment. One wrong move and he could stall the plane or send it into a dive. But Marcus was right. The autopilot was losing the fight. The plane was bucking and shaking, dropping 100 feet at a time. Henry reached for the autopilot disconnect button. He paused, his finger on the switch. This was the moment. Once he pressed this button, there was no going back. He pressed it. The yoke came alive in his hands, resisting him, fighting him. The plane wanted to roll to the left. Henry pulled it back to level, overcorrecting, then correcting again. The nose pitched up too high. He eased it down. His movements were jerky. This was nothing like the simulator. The plane was a living thing, wild and powerful, and Henry was just a kid trying to hold on. Marcus talked him through it. Small inputs, gentle corrections. Watch the artificial horizon. Trust the instruments. Do not look outside. Henry listened. He focused. Slowly, painfully, he began to feel the plane. He began to understand how it moved, how it responded. The storm raged around him. Lightning flashed. Rain hammered the windscreen. But inside the cockpit, Henry was finding a rhythm. Minutes stretched into hours. Marcus stayed on the radio the whole time, guiding Henry, encouraging him. Other controllers came on the line, specialists who knew the systems, who could talk Henry through problems as they came up. The passengers had no idea what was happening. The flight attendants had told them that there was a technical issue, that everything was under control. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Panic would help no one. Henry flew the plane south, away from the worst of the storm, toward clearer skies. His arms ached. His back screamed. Sweat dripped into his eyes. But he did not let go of the yoke. Marcus told him that they were going to divert to Houston. It was the closest major airport, with long runways and emergency crews standing by. Henry was going to have to land the plane. The thought was impossible. Landing was the hardest part of flying, the moment when most accidents happened. Even experienced pilots struggled with landings in bad weather. How could he, a 17-year-old kid with no real experience, possibly land a commercial jet? But there was no choice. The pilots were still unconscious. No one else could do it. Marcus began to walk Henry through the approach. He explained the sequence of steps, the altitudes, the speeds. Henry listened, trying to absorb it all, knowing that one mistake could kill everyone on board. The storm began to clear. The turbulence eased. Henry could see lights below now, the sprawl of Houston stretching across the darkness. Marcus vectored him toward the airport, guiding him onto the approach path. Henry lowered the landing gear. The plane shuddered. He extended the flaps. The plane slowed, the nose pitching up. He adjusted the throttle, the yoke, trying to keep everything stable. The runway appeared ahead, a thin line of lights in the darkness. It looked impossibly small, impossibly far away. Marcus called out altitudes. 500 feet. 400. 300. Henry was too high, too fast. He pulled back the throttle. The plane dropped. Too much, he added, power. The plane ballooned back up. He was fighting it, overcorrecting, making it worse. Marcus stayed calm. He told Henry to breathe, to relax his grip, to let the plane settle. Henry tried. 200 feet. The runway was rushing up. 100 feet. Henry flared the nose, pulling back on the yoke. The plane hung in the air for a moment. Then the wheels touched. Hard, too hard. The plane bounced back into the air. Henry felt a surge of panic. He was going to crash. He was going to kill everyone. Marcus shouted at him to add power, to go around, to try again. But Henry did not add power. Some instinct, some deep part of him that had flown this approach 1,000 times in his bedroom, told him to stay with it. He pushed the yoke forward. The wheels touched again. This time they stayed down. The plane rolled along the runway, fast and shaking. Henry hit the brakes. Too hard. The plane skidded. He eased off, then reapplied them. Slower, steadier. The plane decelerated. It slowed. It stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the cabin erupted in cheers and applause. People were crying, hugging each other. Henry sat in the captain's seat, his hands still gripping the yoke, unable to believe what had just happened. Emergency crews swarmed the plane. Paramedics rushed aboard and took the pilots away. Both Captain Ross and First Officer Huang would recover fully, though they had no memory of the lightning strike or what came after. Henry was led off the plane by airport officials. He was shaking, exhausted, barely able to walk. The passengers did not know who he was at first. Then word spread. The boy, the teenager, the kid who had saved them all. People stopped him, thanked him, hugged him. A woman with tears streaming down her face told him that she had 3 children at home who still had a mother because of him. A man shook his hand and said that he was a hero. Henry did not feel like a hero. He felt like he was going to throw up. The story broke within hours. News crews descended on the airport. Henry's name and face were everywhere. People called him a miracle. They called him brave. They called him the youngest person to ever land a commercial jet. Experts analyzed the flight data and said that his landing, while rough, had been technically sound. He had done everything right. The National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation into the lightning strike and the toxic fume release. Changes were made to cockpit ventilation systems. New protocols were put in place. But the real story, the one that people kept talking about, was Henry, the quiet kid from Seattle who had spent years preparing for something he'd never expected to happen. In the weeks that followed, Henry tried to return to normal life. He went back to school, back to his simulator, back to being invisible. But things had changed. People recognized him now. They asked for autographs. They wanted to take pictures. Colleges reached out, offering scholarships. Flight schools offered free training. His parents looked at him differently, with a kind of awe and pride that made him uncomfortable. Henry did not want to be famous. He did not want to be a hero. He just wanted to fly. A year later, Henry enrolled in a professional flight training program. He earned his private pilot's license, then his commercial license. He studied hard, flew every chance he got, and never forgot the night that changed everything. He thought often about the moment when the flight attendant had asked if anyone had flight experience. He thought about how close he had come to staying in his seat, to keeping quiet, to letting fear win. He thought about the 143 people who had gone home to their families because he had stood up. Sometimes people ask Henry if he was scared that night. He always says yes. He was terrified. But being scared did not matter. What mattered was that someone had to do something, and he was the only one who could. That is the thing about courage. It is not about not being afraid. It is about being afraid and doing it anyway. It is about standing up when no one else will, about taking responsibility even when you are not sure you can handle it. Henry Mitchell was just a kid with a hobby. But when the moment came, he was ready. And that made all the difference. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe for more videos like this.